it's a non-atomic proposition that has as a constituent at least one atomic proposition with X as a constituent. Second assumption, constituency isn't transitive. You could probably motivate that based on what these people think propositions are. And if that's the case, then 7 is not obviously true, right? Because we're looking at a non-atomic proposition. It's not the case that Lincoln exists. So the thought is that, well, even though it has as a constituent a proposition that has as a constituent Lincoln, it doesn't follow that it's not the case that Lincoln exists as a constituent Lincoln. You might say, well, what makes it the case that it's directly about it? And I say, well, it's appropriately related to a proposition that has as a constituent Lincoln.
So in a way, that objection, I think, it's not really an objection to, so we agree that just sort of by definition, the received view is that singular propositions have their own individual constituents.
Sure.
And what you want to say is these propositions aren't really singular because singular propositions you want to add now are atomic, right? And this isn't singular because it's not atomic, therefore it doesn't have a constituent. It is somehow structured out of something with a negation and an atomic proposition, but that's not singular, so it's not its constituent. Then I would have to replace the premise that says if a proposition exists and has constituents, then its constituents exist, which is the serious actualism-based premise. Mm-hmm. To avoid your move, I would just say if a proposition is structured in such a way that one of its parts has X as a constituent, then X exists. And so maybe they want to deny transitivity of constituency. That's fine. Still, it looks like, at least I would want to say this, serious actualists ought to say having as a constituent something that has X as a constituent commits you to the existence of X.
Okay, thanks.
Well, what do I do now?
I think you pick Al. You have to pick Al. It's his thing.
May I ask you to yield to Alvin, and then we'll come back to you, okay? Go ahead.
Well, first, Trenton, I'd like to thank you for your very spirited and somewhat facile defense of some of the things I think are true. But I do have the same problem that Peter has, and I'm not quite convinced that you answered Peter entirely. Yeah. So I understand this proposition now. It looks to me like the proposition in question expressed by no man does not exist is something like the essence that would have been exemplified had sperm S and egg E been united is unexemplified. And that's a perfectly sensible proposition. But you go on to say that you conclude that no man does not exist expresses a singular proposition about no man, namely that no man does not exist. Now it's clear that this sentence, the way you're explaining it, expresses a proposition about that essence, but it doesn't express the proposition about that essence that it doesn't exist, since right. Presumably, clearly enough, this essence does exist and exists necessarily. So I'm not sure that what we've got here is a sentence that expresses a proposition about anything other than that essence. And if that's the case, it doesn't express the proposition that no man does not exist if no man if the proposition is explained in that way, since that proposition is obviously false.
Do you think there's a proposition that Plantinga does not exist? I mean, a false proposition? Does that proposition exist?
Yes, I do think
and
so.
Do you think that the non-exemplification of your essence is sufficient for that propositions to be true?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. So you think there are possible worlds where that Plantinga, the singular proposition that Plantinga does not exist, exists and is true?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I would say, so maybe to sort of fill in a little more detailed response to Peter, keeping that move in mind, go to the world where you don't exist, we've got the sufficiency. I would say, if you can lock on to the true proposition, no manicity is not exemplified, that's going to be logically sufficient for a relevant singular proposition, right? That X does not exist. It's hard to know how to say it, right? Because in the world in which that no manicity is not exemplified as false, then there's going to be a singular proposition about the exemplifier of no manicity.
Well, maybe the problem here is still with the term about.
Sure, that's fine. I'm sorry.
I guess I would say the proposition Plantinga does not exist is not about Plantinga in worlds in which Plantinga does not exist. sometimes a proposition like that is about, well, such propositions are always about essences, and sometimes they're also about other things.
Yeah.
But being about Plantinga would be a contingent property of the proposition. And so I would say here, with respect to no man, it's not the case that, that this proposition, no man does not exist, is about no man. I mean, there isn't any individual that this thing is about. It's not introduced in such a way that it would be about any individual.
So I think in a way, I'm not sure yet that we really disagree. I think in a way your view, what you're suggesting here is sort of like what Ed suggested earlier, and that is that let's take direct aboutness not to be definitive of the relevant singular propositions, but just to be a contingent feature they often have, right? And so you think that Plantinga does not exist. That is a singular proposition. It's contingently about you. In other worlds in which it's true, it's still a singular proposition. We won't want to say about you. It's hard to know exactly what we can say. It's a singular proposition that's made true by the non-exemplification of Plantinganicity. We can say that.
Right. Because in these
that's
worlds,
right.
all it's about is Plantinga.
Yeah, that's right. I think I'm sure that everything I say here is consistent with that way of doing it. And then we just sort of, so now what I say is, look, we've locked on to nomenicity, the essence. It's not exemplified. Therefore, its non-exemplification makes true a certain singular proposition. I'm not going to say it's about nomen, but it's the singular proposition that would be false if nomenicity would exemplify it. And it's related to nomenicity in the way Plantinga does not exist is related to Plantinganicity. And I'll call that, now that's the singular proposition about the person who would have had nomenicity, something like that. And I can run all the same things. So my focus so the reason I sort of went after the aboutness assumption was because I was assuming that, or I was treating is directly about, just to be definitive of what it is to be a singular proposition. And then I was sort of really weakening the notion of directly about.
Well, we'd have to take a look at A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H and see whether they still really work under the assumption that no man does not exist is really only about the essence. I'm not sure it does, but I haven't had a chance to make
Yeah. Does it help if I say I'm absolutely certain it would work? Does that help at all?
You're absolutely certain it would work. Well, optimism is a great virtue.
Yeah, that's right.
Is true in a vacuous sense of truth, right? So when we say that if P, then it is true, then it is true that P, we think that's true and is a necessary truth because it has no instances in which the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. So it's true kind of in virtue of a negative fact, if you will, right? The lack of a true, of the truth antecedent and a false consequent. But when you get to the fourth claim, if a proposition is true, then that proposition exists. It seems to me that that's only plausible if we're thinking of truth not in a vacuous sense, but in a robust sense, something that's non-vacuously the case. And I was trying, to apply this to, like propositions, like the claim that, proposition that there are no propositions. That seems like a proposition, but of course, you can't, if you think it's true, then you can't conclude that the proposition exists because you'd have a contradiction there, right?
So it must not be true.
So I don't know. Do you have a response to that? Did they worry about equivocation between?
Sure. I don't. I didn't hear you. You accused me of a particular equivocation. You did say, you began by saying that premise 2, the conditional might be true vacuously because the antecedent is false. Is that right? Is that what you meant to say?
Well, because you have no instances of the schema, if P, then it is true
So
that
I wouldn't-
P, in which the antecedent is true and the consequence false. So as a principle, that's true, but true in a vacuous sense. But then it seems to me,
Okay, so
once you get down
let me
to
back up. So suppose 2 is true vacuously. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter. If the argument's valid and all the premises are true, then the conclusion's true, and that's all I care about.
Yeah, well, I think if you're going to apply it apply that truth of the claim in the fourth statement, I think there you need the truth to be true